Inside Folsom Prison, locked down California. For more than 140 years, this prison has stood as a symbol of California's harshest realities. Its walls were built by inmates. Its reputation was forged through riots, executions, lockdowns, and reform. And its name has become synonymous with American incarceration. This is not a myth. This is not folklore. This is Folsom Prison, one of the oldest continuously operating prisons in the United States. Behind these walls, generations of men have lived under strict control, evolving policies, and relentless scrutiny. What happens inside Folsom is shaped not by legend, but by law, history, and documented fact. This is Inside Folsom Prison, locked down California. Before we continue, if you value deep, factual, and cinematic prison documentaries, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Inmate Diaries. Your support directly helps us continue researching, verifying, and sharing these important stories, with accuracy, respect, and truth. Now, let's go inside. The birth of Folsom Prison, 1850s-1880. Folsom State Prison was born out of California's explosive population growth following the gold rush. By the 1850s, crime rates in the state surged, and existing jail facilities were overwhelmed. In 1858, the California legislature approved plans for a new state prison near the American River, a site chosen not only for isolation, but for its granite quarries. Construction began using inmate labor, a practice common in the 19th century and legal at the time. Prisoners quarried stone, hauled materials, and built the very cells they would later occupy. By 1880, Folsom State Prison officially opened. From the beginning, it was designed for maximum control, not rehabilitation. Cells measured approximately 4 by 8 feet, contained no plumbing, and relied on strict silence rules. Lighting was minimal. Ventilation was poor. Movement was heavily restricted. These conditions were documented in early state inspection records, which acknowledged the harshness but deemed it necessary for discipline. Folsom was never intended to be humane by modern standards. It was intended to be secure. Daily life in early Folsom. In its early decades, daily life inside Folsom was rigid and unforgiving. Inmates followed a strict regimented schedule. Speaking without permission could result in punishment. Work assignments were mandatory and physically demanding, often centered around quarry labor or maintenance. Punishments documented in official prison logs included solitary confinement, bread and water diets, loss of privileges. Corporal punishment, including the use of restraints, was legal in earlier periods, though its frequency varied by administration. Medical care was minimal and inconsistently documented, especially in the late 19th century. Mental health treatment, as understood today, did not exist. Mortality rates during the early years were higher than modern standards, though exact figures remain incomplete or unclear due to limited record keeping. What is clear is that survival inside Folsom required compliance. Not respect. Not reform. Just obedience. Executions and the death house era. Between 1895 and 1937, Folsom Prison served as one of California's primary execution sites. Executions were carried out by hanging, later replaced by the gas chamber in 1937. The gas chamber would eventually be moved to San Quentin, but Folsom's role in capital punishment left a permanent mark. According to state execution records, 93 inmates were executed at Folsom during this period. Executions were not public. They were witnessed by officials, physicians, and select witnesses as required by law. There is no verified evidence that executions were used as public deterrent spectacles at Folsom, despite popular myths suggesting otherwise. The psychological impact of the death house on inmates and staff was acknowledged in later correctional studies, though first-hand accounts from this era remain limited and fragmented. By the late 1930s, executions at Folsom ceased entirely. But the legacy remained. Folsom's reputation grows, 1940s, 1960s. By the mid-20th century, Folsom had developed a national reputation as one of California's toughest prisons. This reputation was fueled by several factors. A growing population of violent felony offenders. Overcrowding during post-war years. Limited rehabilitation programming compared to newer institutions. Official records show repeated periods of lockdowns, often triggered by violence, contraband discoveries, or staff shortages. Contrary to popular belief, Folsom was not classified as the state's most violent prison at all times. Violence levels fluctuated year by year, and comparisons with San Quentin and later facilities like Pelican Bay vary depending on time period. However, Folsom consistently housed inmates serving long sentences, including life terms, which contributed to heightened tension. By the 1960s, the prison was operating under mounting pressure, socially, politically, and structurally. Change was coming. But not without resistance. Folsom Prison had survived its first century. But the decades ahead would test it in ways no architect could have predicted. Riots. Reforms. Cultural transformation. And a system struggling to redefine punishment in modern America. Unrest, riots, and a system under pressure, 1960s, 1970s. California in turmoil, Folsom on edge. By the early 1960s, California itself was changing rapidly. Civil rights movements, anti-war protests, and growing distrust of government institutions were reshaping the nation. Prisons did not exist outside this reality, they absorbed its pressure. At Folsom, these changes collided with an aging facility, overcrowded cell blocks, and a population increasingly aware of legal rights. According to California Department of Corrections records, Folsom was operating near, and at times beyond, its intended capacity during this period. Cells designed for one inmate were sometimes housing two, a practice known as double celling, which significantly increased tension. Educational and rehabilitation programs existed but were limited in reach and funding. Most inmates spent long hours confined to cells or working prison labor assignments. Official internal reports from the era describe a growing sense of frustration, not only among inmates, but among staff facing understaffing and outdated security infrastructure. Folsom was becoming volatile. The 1967 Folsom Prison disturbance. One of the most significant documented incidents in Folsom's modern history occurred in 1967. That year, a large-scale inmate disturbance broke out inside the prison. While often referred to informally as a riot, official records classify it as a coordinated uprising involving multiple housing units. According to state investigations, several inmates were injured. Hostages were briefly taken. Property damage occurred inside secured areas. There is no publicly documented evidence of inmate deaths during this specific incident. The disturbance lasted several hours before correctional officers regained full control using tactical containment measures, not military force. Following the incident, the prison entered an extended lockdown period, suspending normal movement, programming, and visitation. The state launched a formal review into Folsom's security practices, staffing levels, and inmate management policies. The conclusion was clear. Folsom's infrastructure was no longer adequate for the population it housed. Lockdown as a way of life. After 1967, lockdowns became more frequent, not just at Folsom, but across California's prison system. A lockdown meant inmates confined to cells for 23 to 24 hours a day. Meals delivered through cell doors. All programs suspended. Visits canceled indefinitely. Lockdowns were implemented for reasons including violence between inmates, discovery of weapons or contraband, intelligence suggesting planned disturbances, staff shortages. Official policy documents from the late 1960s show that lockdowns were considered preventative tools, not punishments, though their psychological effects were later questioned by researchers. Studies conducted in subsequent decades linked prolonged lockdowns to increased stress, anxiety, and institutional tension, though such findings were not widely acknowledged at the time. At Folsom, lockdown was no longer an emergency measure. It was becoming routine. The shadow of San Quentin and comparisons. Throughout this era, Folsom was frequently compared to San Quentin State Prison, California's other historic maximum security facility. While San Quentin housed death row and execution facilities, Folsom was known for tighter movement controls, older cellhouse architecture, a higher proportion of long-term inmates. Contrary to popular culture portrayals, official violence statistics from the 1960s show that neither prison consistently ranked as most violent every year. Rates fluctuated based on population, policy changes, and leadership. What made Folsom stand out was not constant violence, but persistent tension. Correctional officers described an environment where small incidents could escalate quickly due to confined spaces and limited visibility. Folsom was a pressure cooker. Johnny Cash and the public image shift. In 1968, Folsom Prison entered the global spotlight, not through violence, but through music. Country singer Johnny Cash performed a live concert inside the prison, later released as at Folsom Prison. This event is often misunderstood. The concert did not change prison policy. It did not improve inmate conditions directly. And it was not intended as a reform initiative. However, it did something powerful. It humanized inmates in the public eye. For the first time, millions of Americans saw incarcerated men not as statistics, but as an audience. Prison administrators approved the event under strict security protocols. No disturbances occurred. The long-term cultural impact was significant, but its operational impact on Folsom was minimal. The prison remained locked down, tightly controlled, and structurally unchanged. The rise of inmate legal awareness. By the early 1970s, inmates across California, including at Folsom, were becoming increasingly legally informed. Landmark court cases expanded prisoners' rights related to access to legal materials, religious practice, protection from cruel and unusual punishment. Folsom saw a rise in inmate grievances, civil rights lawsuits, federal oversight inquiries. While not all complaints were upheld, the volume itself signaled a shift. Inmates were no longer silent. Correctional administrators faced growing pressure to modernize policies, even as security concerns remained unresolved. Folsom stood at a crossroads. The unrest of the 1960s and early 1970s left Folsom changed, but not transformed. Security tightened. Lockdowns increased. And the prison's identity hardened. But the most dramatic shift was still ahead. Race, gangs, and the era of permanent lockdown, 1970s, 1980s. A prison mirroring society. By the mid-1970s, Folsom Prison was no longer just housing inmates, it was reflecting the fractures of the outside world. Across California, racial tension had intensified following civil rights struggles, urban unrest, and controversial policing practices. Inside prisons, those tensions were often magnified. Official correctional reports from this period confirm that inmates at Folsom increasingly self-segregated along racial lines, particularly in housing units and the yard. This segregation was not mandated by official policy, but it was widely tolerated as a security management strategy. Administrators believed separating rival groups reduced immediate violence, though long-term consequences were unclear at the time. Folsom was entering an era where control often outweighed integration. The emergence of prison gang influence. During the late 1970s, prison gangs became a growing concern at Folsom. Correctional intelligence units documented the increasing presence of organized inmate groups tied to ethnic and regional identities. These groups were not officially named in early reports, and much of their internal structure remains partially undocumented. However, authorities confirmed that gang affiliation influenced Housing placement. Yard movement. Personal safety. Violence linked to gang disputes was recorded, though exact attribution was sometimes unclear due to inmate silence and limited surveillance technology at the time. What is verifiable is this. Gang presence changed how Folsom operated. Security classifications became stricter. Lockdowns became longer. Movement became more limited. The prison was adapting, but at a cost. Lockdown becomes systemic. By the early 1980s, lockdowns at Folsom were no longer temporary disruptions. They were embedded into daily operations. Internal policy documents show that entire housing units could remain locked down for weeks or months following violent incidents, even if only a small number of inmates were directly involved. This approach was justified as a preventative security measure. However, later academic evaluations raised concerns about collective punishment and its impact on inmate behavior and mental health. At the time, those concerns received little attention. The priority was control. Folsom was now widely classified as a high-security, high-risk institution, despite not being officially designated as a supermax facility. Staff under pressure. The strain was not limited to inmates. Correctional officers at Folsom faced mandatory overtime, high-stress assignments, increased risk of assault. Union records and internal memos from the period document rising concerns about staff safety and burnout. Training standards were evolving, but many officers were still working within an aging physical environment not designed for modern security challenges. Folsom's architecture, narrow tiers, blind corners, thick stone walls, made surveillance difficult. Both inmates and staff were operating inside a system under constant tension. Media, myth, and misrepresentation. By the 1980s, Folsom Prison had become a fixture in American pop culture. Media portrayals often emphasized violence, brutality, hopelessness. While these elements existed, official data shows that coverage often lacked context, failing to distinguish between isolated incidents and systemic trends. Some stories exaggerated conditions. Others omitted key facts. As a result, Folsom's public image drifted further from its documented reality, becoming a symbol rather than a place. This gap between perception and fact would later complicate reform efforts. Early reform attempts and limitations. Despite its reputation, Folsom was not completely resistant to change. By the late 1980s, limited programs existed for adult basic education, vocational training, substance abuse counseling. Participation, however, was inconsistent due to frequent lockdowns and security restrictions. Budget constraints and political pressure limited expansion. Official evaluations from the period described these programs as supplemental rather than transformative. Reform was discussed. But security always came first. By the end of the 1980s, Folsom Prison had entered a new identity. No longer just historic. No longer just notorious. It had become a lockdown institution shaped by race, control, and survival. But the most dramatic transformation was still ahead. Modern Folsom and the legacy of lockdown, 1990s, present. The tough-on-crime era. In the 1990s, California entered the tough-on-crime era. Mandatory minimum sentences, 3 strikes laws, and longer prison terms dramatically increased inmate populations statewide. Folsom Prison was directly affected. According to California Department of Corrections data, the prison housed a growing number of inmates serving long-term and life sentences, intensifying security concerns. Lockdowns became longer and more frequent, often tied to racial violence, gang intelligence, or statewide security alerts. By policy, these lockdowns were considered preventative, though critics argued they became normalized. Folsom was no longer just historic, it was fully embedded in California's mass incarceration system. Security versus reform. Entering the 2000s, Folsom implemented modern security upgrades. Electronic surveillance. Controlled movement schedules. Enhanced classification systems. Educational and vocational programs continued, but access remained inconsistent due to lockdowns and staffing limitations. Federal court rulings addressing prison overcrowding impacted California broadly, but Folsom's high-security status meant change came slowly. The institution remained focused on containment over rehabilitation. Folsom today. Today, Folsom Prison remains an active maximum security facility. It houses inmates serving long sentences under strict supervision. Violence exists, but fluctuates year to year, not constantly escalating, not eliminated. Lockdowns still occur. So do limited programs. So does scrutiny. Folsom is neither the worst prison in California, nor a reformed model institution. It is a controlled environment shaped by history, policy, and consequence. The legacy. Folsom Prison has outlived reform movements, political eras, and public opinion. Built by inmates. Defined by control. Shaped by fear, law, and survival. Its story is not one of legend, but of documented reality. And that reality continues. Folsom Prison is more than a name, it's a reflection of how society chooses punishment over time. If you value fully factual, deeply researched prison documentaries, subscribe to the Inmate Diaries. We don't tell myths. We document reality.